Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at The History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at thehistoryguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy tells 3 stories surrounding Pearl Harbor. First, he'll tell the story of the unsung heroics of the Sikorsky JRS-1s, small, unarmed planes that faced incredible danger during and after the attack on December 7th. Then he'll tell the story of 2 pilots who got into the air that fateful day, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor. Finally, he'll tell the story of one of the Pearl Harbor battleships sunk that day, the only battleship to also shell the shores of Normandy on D-Day. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
When the Japanese attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the 440-acre islet called Ford Island was a central target. Not only were 7 of the 8 battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet that were at Pearl Harbor moored in Battleship Row near Ford Island, but the island included a naval air station, the headquarters of the Navy's Patrol Wing 2. Destruction of the Navy Air Station was a high-value target for the Japanese, especially the Navy's 33 consolidated Catalina PBYs. The PBY was an amphibious patrol bomber whose range made it an excellent scouting aircraft. By attacking the seaplane facilities on Ford Island, the Imperial Japanese Navy was trying to blind the American Navy, taking away its ability to find the Japanese fleet. Of 33 PBYs at Pearl Harbor, 24 were destroyed and 6 others damaged beyond repair. Only 3 that had been on patrol at the time of the attack were undamaged. And yet the attack had skipped one part of Ford Island. 10 Sikorsky JRS-1 amphibious aircraft of the Navy's Utility Squadron 1 were undamaged. The JRS-1 is the Navy designation for the Sikorsky S-43, a twin-engine amphibious aircraft that airlines referred to as the Baby Clipper. First flown in 1935, the aircraft could accommodate up to 25 passengers. The plane had an 86-foot wingspan and was 51 foot 2 inches long. Powered by 2 750-horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engines, the plane had a maximum speed of 190 miles per hour and a range of 775 miles. In all, 53 S-34s were produced. Pan American Airways used the S-34 for routes in Latin America, and 3 operated as part of an inter-island service in Hawaii. 5 of the aircraft were purchased by the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1937, and 17 were purchased by the U.S. Navy between 1937 and 1939, where they were designated the JRS-1. 2 of those 17 served with the Marine Corps. The 10 JRS-1s of Utility Squadron VJ-1 had been moved to Hawaii in 1940, and were the Pacific Fleet's photographic unit. Their main function was aerial photography, although utility squadrons were multi-purpose units, developed as a you-call, we-haul operation, and sometimes referred to as the handyman of the air. The utility squadrons towed targets for gunnery practice, took aerial photographs to, for example, spot torpedoes used in torpedo practice so that they may be recovered. But they were very commonly used for transport, when and where the Navy needed, and to carry the mail, a critical practice for maintaining morale. Representing these roles, the logo of Utility Squadron VJ-1 was a pelican carrying a bag of mail with its feet and a photographer in its beak. In fact, the JRS-1s of VJ-1 were brightly painted, not like combat aircraft, but for their role delivering the mail. The planes were silver and orange-yellow with a bright green tail and red trim. Although they were sometimes used for escort duty and had racks that allowed them to be armed with depth charges to attack submarines, they included no guns, their role being described generally as a flying pickup truck. Lawrence Burke, a curator at the National Air and Space Museum, described them as the station wagon of its day that did all the boring jobs that needed to be done. But in the immediate wake of the attack, with the Pacific Fleet's air assets largely in ruins, The JRS-1s were pressed into service beyond all expectations. The JRS-1s would have to go in search of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese fleet was still lurking somewhere nearby, and no one knew their intent. The Navy needed to know if more attacks were coming, or, an even greater fear, if an invasion of the Hawaiian Islands was on its way. But if the unarmed JRS-1s were to find the Japanese fleet, that fleet would be protected by fighter aircraft, like the Mitsubishi A6M0, nearly 3 times as fast as the JRS-1 and mounting 20mm cannons in their wings. For defense, JRS-1 crews were issued rifles and Marine and Army volunteers who would sit at the back doors of the aircraft. The plan, if they ran into Japanese fighter aircraft, was to try to shoot at those aircraft with rifles out the windows. In fact, that was a suicide mission. If one of the JRS-1s were to encounter the Japanese fleet, the only hope was that they could radio the fleet's location before being shot down. And still their crews went up, searching for the fleet that had devastated the U.S. Pacific Squadron. They flew just under the cloud cover, hoping to disappear into the clouds if they encountered any hostile aircraft. While they never encountered the Japanese fleet, in retrospect it appears that one of the JS-1s got within 40 miles of them. Their service in searching, despite having no realistic defense had they succeeded in finding their quarry, can only be described as heroic. JRS-1s also played a critical role in surveying the damage from the attack. If you see an aerial photograph of Pearl Harbor showing damage from the attack, odds are it was taken by a JRS-1. Only one JRS-1 is known to survive. It is currently being restored by the U.S. National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It is one of only a handful of aircraft that were on station at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, that is known to survive, and the only such plane in the museum's collection.
Next up, the history guy tells the story of George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, who managed to get their planes up against incredible odds on December 7, 1941.
In the chaos of the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, only 8 U.S. pilots managed to get aircraft airborne in order to contest the nearly 400 Japanese that were attacking the island of Oahu. The story of 2 of those really does stand out, and it always surprises me when I find out people who don't know the names of George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, because their story at Pearl Harbor is really extraordinary. But more than that, and more than the fact that both of them were heroes in every sense of the word, is the great lesson that what they did teaches about how to respond under pressure. And so today we're going to talk about the hero pilots of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack commenced at 7:48 a.m. 353 planes in 2 waves reached Oahu. The torpedo bombers took advantage of the surprise and attacked the ships in the harbor, focusing on the battleships. The dive bombers attacked the Army air bases at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field in order to prevent Americans from taking off and defending the island. While all that was going on, 2 American fighter pilots in Oahu had been out all night partying. George Welch was a native of Wilmington, Delaware. He completed 3 years studying mechanical engineering at Purdue University before joining the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1939. After receiving his wings in January of 1941, he was posted to the 47th Pursuit Squadron, Wheeler Field, Oahu. On December 7, 1941, he was 23 years old. Kenneth Taylor hailed from Enid, Oklahoma. He spent 2 years studying pre-law at the University of Oklahoma before joining the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1940. After receiving his wings in April of 1941, he was also posted to the 47th Pursuit Squadron. On December 7, 1941, he was just 21 years old. Both were good pilots. Their commanding officer, General Gordon Austin, had made them both flight commanders. The week before the Japanese attack, the 47th Pursuit Squadron was temporarily moved from Wheeler Field to the unpaved auxiliary airstrip at Haleiwa for gunnery practice. The night of December 6th, there had been a big dance at the Officers' Club. Eager to impress the ladies, Welch and Taylor had worn their best mess dress, the Army equivalent of a tuxedo. After the dance, they joined some other officers for an all-night poker game. They were just wrapping up when the bombs started falling. The first wave hit their home field at Wheeler Field hard. The Army hadn't anticipated an air attack, so they'd had the aircraft group up to make them easier to defend from sabotage. That made them easy targets for the Japanese dive bombers, and now the aircraft that were needed to defend Oahu from this attack were in flames. But Welch and Taylor realized that the auxiliary base over at Haleiwa might not have been targeted yet. So they called ahead and asked that their two Curtiss P-40B pursuit fighters be fueled and armed. Running outside, they jumped into Taylor's Buick, Japanese machine guns kicking up dust around them. They raced down the 10-mile road to the airbase, sometimes reaching speeds of 100 miles an hour. When they got to Haleiwa, they realized it hadn't been attacked yet, and their fighters were sitting there, fueled, armed, and waiting for them. Still wearing their tuxedo pants from the night before, they jumped into their airplanes and took off. The sky was full of Japanese airplanes, 2 pilots against hundreds. They saw a flight of dive bombers and charged in, guns blazing. Each of them took down 2 enemy aircraft before they were out of ammunition. They returned to heavily damaged Wheeler Field in order to rearm. When they landed, Taylor had been wounded by a bullet that came through his cockpit, and one of Welch's guns was jammed. The ammunition for their planes was in a burning warehouse, and the ground crews had to run into the inferno in order to get ammunition to rearm. Before they could be fully rearmed, the Japanese attacked again, and so they took off, charging, guns blazing before they were even in the air. They took down another 3 Japanese aircraft before the Japanese attack was over. At the end of the day, George Welch was credited with 4 air victories and Kenneth Taylor with 2, although some evidence that they shot down at least a couple of other Japanese planes. That's out of a total of just 10 confirmed air victories for all American pilots at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. A War Department communique on December 13, 1941, proclaimed Taylor and Welch the first 2 American heroes of the Second World War. They were both given the Distinguished Service Cross, which is second only to the Congressional Medal of Honor, and Taylor won the Purple Heart. George Welch went on to serve 3 tours in the Pacific and finished the war with 16 confirmed air victories, an ace 3 times over. After the war, he was a test pilot for many years and tragically died in 1954 when the experimental jet that he was testing broke up in midair. Kenneth Taylor went on to fly out of the famous Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and then train pilots in the United States. He ended the war an ace with 6 confirmed victories. He served in the active military for 27 years and then with the Alaska Air National Guard, and finally retired a brigadier general. He passed away in 2006. In an interview in 2003, Kenneth Taylor summed up perhaps the very nature of heroism. He said, "I wasn't terrified in the least, and let me tell you why. I was too young and too stupid to know that I was in a lot of danger." So what do we learn from this? I mean, it's an exciting story, but it didn't change the war. Shoot, their actions that day didn't even really change the battle. And yet, 2 guys took on a whole sea of enemies and somehow gave much better than they got. And there must be something to learn from that. Well, what Taylor and Welch really did was they acted. They took initiative. They had faith in their abilities and their equipment. They followed their training. They didn't sit. They acted. And that seems to be a hallmark of heroism, just a hallmark of success. Faith in your abilities and the willingness to act on that faith.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and of course some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. So when this episode airs, we'll be about a week past the 81st anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so we thought it was a good time to talk about some of the amazing stories that are there in Pearl Harbor and the various stories of heroism and all the kinds of things that we can talk about. And so the 2 episodes we just listened to are both, I think, examples of kind of forgotten history with Pearl Harbor. And you think of...
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the story of Welch and Taylor is a little bit more told, and they told a really, screwed up, perverted version of it in the Michael Bay Pearl Harbor movie. That was really not too close to the truth. But I mean, I think maybe people have heard of them. I think the JRS-1 is truly an untold story, and they're untold, the unsung heroes, really, those little, pickup trucks, or what they call them, station wagons that were doing that sort of support work. Yeah. But I mean, I think those are, and there's a lot of those at Pearl Harbor. There's a lot of really forgotten stories of Pearl Harbor, and some of them, are truly permanently forgotten, in that there was a lot of heroism, of course, and that was on the Arizona that no one was there to remember, or to document. So it was, I mean, there was such a chaotic day. And people who didn't really know that they were at war, that there were a lot of actions that were really just incredibly selfless.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we could keep telling stories for a long time about Pearl Harbor.
One of the stories, you start with the Sikorskys, you start talking about the Catalinas, which end up getting all shot up. I've always kind of had a soft spot for the Catalinas because they're just They're one of those planes that I don't think gets talked about too much, but that played significant roles.
Absolutely critical role, yeah. And we talked about them in different ways, but like Johnston Atoll was a seaplane base, and it's interesting that when the Japanese attacked, when they planned the attack, the very first attacks came not on the battleships but on Ford Island.
Yeah,
and that was a very specific strategic decision by the Japanese to blind the U.S. Navy by destroying that seaplane base. And so they really saw the Catalinas as being the number one target, and that really shows their understanding of what it means, to have those patrol aircraft.
Yeah, I think we get to some extent, Pearl Harbor is very well known as an event, but it's certain parts of it. And so you get some of the stuff buried, and the audacity of this Japanese surprise attack and the horrors that they rained down on the people of Pearl Harbor. I think that when you look at it from where the Japanese were coming strategically, it's very clear what they were trying to do. And I think that I think that they knew what they were getting themselves into. I also think that they had higher hopes for what they would be able to do about it.
Yeah, I mean, part of it was a thought maybe that they were going to delay the U.S. being able to respond for some large period of time or something. I don't know how realistic that was. Nimitz later said that if they destroyed the oil tanks, that it could have delayed us by a year. I don't know how much of that was a story that he was telling, because honestly, we've told other stories of the Second World War, like Clearfield Naval Supply Depot. I mean, inside of a year, they've got a city-size storage base that's providing equipment for the entire Pacific Fleet, and so I don't know how much you could have delayed anything. Once the United States was angry, I mean, we could just produce on levels that were crazy. I mean, if they'd sunk the entire fleet, we could have replaced the entire fleet, and we actually had quite a lot of that fleet. Was actually of the stuff that we used during the war was already in production at the time of Pearl Harbor. But it's very clear, what they were targeting first and what they were really trying to do is delay American response. But I think that there was at least this hope that if they sank the battleships, that we would decide it wasn't worth it. Yeah. That we would decide that, we didn't want to, that our Pacific fleet is gone and we're not going to contest the Philippines.
Which I feel like they must have known that was probably unlikely, but hoped it was possible. And I mean, maybe they convinced themselves that it was going to be more likely. I mean, ultimately, it was a miscalculation if they truly believed that the U.S. was just going to.
That happened. I mean, it's like a Hail Mary pass in football or something like that. If it succeeds, you're the genius, and if it fails, then you're the goat. And I think the same thing here. When they were, really, when you looked at Japanese militarism, and it's interesting how that developed over time too. But when you look at Japanese militarism, and especially after the oil embargo, because they're fighting in China, Japan realized that they simply had to have the oil reserves of Southeast Asia, and they concluded that in order to do that, they would have to bypass the Philippines, and that the U.S. would try to stop that through the Philippines, and that they had to somehow delay. And so I think the hope was that they would so quickly, by surprise, take over so much of the Pacific that the United States would either be in a hopeless position or that the United States would, be unwilling to respond because of the size of the loss that we took.
Yeah,
and how realistic was that ever? I mean, they talk a lot about that line where Yamamoto said, I fear we've awakened the sleeping dragon. But the entire surprise attack was Yamamoto's idea, so I think that's maybe overstated. But one of the questions has been: had the aircraft carriers been there? And it was really coincidence. I mean, I'm convinced. People want to talk about that being a plot. When you look at where the aircraft carriers were and why they were where they were, it doesn't look like there was any design to that. But had the aircraft carriers been there and been just as devastated as the battle fleet, who knows? I mean, whether we might have been in a position where we could. We didn't end up reinforcing Wake because we thought there was too much risk. So, how far would we have gone? Would we have been willing to give up Hawaii? Would we have been willing to, say we can't defend this without a fleet, and that would have been, it certainly would have put the Japanese in a position where they could have solidified gains in Southeast Asia, and so it was a gambit. But the question is, what other choice did Japan have?
Yeah. Ultimately, I think that's
to
true
achieve
too.
the goals that they wanted to achieve. I don't think Pearl Harbor was inevitable. I don't know if it could have been avoided diplomatically. I think, honestly, if you look through the 30s in Japan, that Japan did not have to move towards militarism, and if they hadn't, then the whole war was unnecessary. But I think by the time that you got to Pearl Harbor, that it probably couldn't be avoided, and they probably didn't really have another realistic choice. The battle plan prior to Pearl Harbor, prior to Yamamoto saying, let's do the surprise attack, the whole idea was that the Japanese fleet was defensive, and the thinking was that our fleet would all pack together, and their fleet would all pack together. We'd go out, meet in the middle of the Pacific somewhere, and that, the Japanese realized that can never be a winning strategy because of oil.
Yeah.
And so when that becomes an impossible strategy, then it's like the von Schlieffen plan or whatever else. I mean, it's a gamble, but you're saying this is our only possibility.
If they wanted to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish.
If they wanted to, otherwise, they just give up now.
War was. I think they realized that if they wanted to do, what they were going to do, war with the U.S. was inevitable, and wouldn't they rather fight us, after they wrecked our fleet?
That's it. I mean, that's what in the First World War too. I mean, Germany calculated. They knew that unrestricted submarine warfare would bring us into the war. The question was, could they get enough advantage out of it before that we could react? And what we did is that in both times we surprised them at how quickly we could react. Yeah. And I don't think any of them truly understood the industrial might of the United States in either time.
I don't know that the U.S. fully. In some ways, I feel like we surprised ourselves because you talk about the Clearfield Depot, but there's also Camp Ellis. I was just doing research for an episode about a munitions factory that essentially just went up almost overnight.
Yeah, we built essentially cities, 50, 60,000 people, and inside of 2 or 3 months.
Crazy.
And we sent. But I mean, there was preparation on the American side too. One of the things that made a difference was that we had really laid the groundwork for a sustainable supply of pilots that ended up making a huge difference in the Pacific. But we reacted very quickly. I think maybe so much you're right, so that we even surprised ourselves at how much we were able to do that.
Yeah, I don't know that we were sure, just how quickly and how much, honestly, how many ships we would be building by the end of the war. I don't know that we knew what that would look like, in 1941.
I think Carl Vinson had an idea, but I don't think that most people did.
But yeah, I think that a lot of people weren't really sure where we were going to end up there, and we ultimately, when you look at it from with hindsight, you're like, man, there was almost no chance for Japan after that. But at the time, I think, I like to talk about that. I don't think that the Japanese would have done it if they thought they had no chance. I think they had some chance of success.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to say because there was some delusion among the militarists in Japan too, there was you sent your troops to they thought because there was a sunflower on the bottom of their gun that they were protected by God. So I think there maybe was some delusion there. I think that probably if a planner really sat down and say our odds against the United States, we're actually a very small island in terms of resources compared to the United States. But their hope also was that we were going to choose to fight in Europe instead, and there was a lot to it. And it's interesting. It brings up another interesting kind of off point that Hitler was completely surprised by Pearl Harbor, didn't know it was coming.
Yeah,
they didn't give him any heads up there, and that really kind of shocked him because he thought the U.S. would be out of the war for longer.
Yeah, I have kind of wondered. Germany didn't have to declare war on the U.S. after that, and they chose to, and I wonder if that. What impact it might have had if they didn't. But I guess we're getting a little off topic from the.
We have wandered around a bit.
Yeah, but it's
as you do.
Both of these episodes that we're talking about really show that desperation to defend Pearl Harbor. It was total chaos, but there's debates over how much we knew and if there were people who should have caught signs, but ultimately
there's still an awful lot of people who believe that FDR knew completely and he let it happen, which I don't think that the evidence supports that really, but I understand the argument and why you would strongly believe the argument.
But certainly the people on the ground, Welch and Taylor, for instance, I don't think they had any idea.
Had no reason to suspect it.
Yeah, completely caught.
We mentioned on Wednesday's episode that Admiral Pai told husband Kimmel, they'll never attack us. We're too strong.
Yeah. And maybe that was some delusion on to say there was some delusion on both sides might be.
Husband Kimmel also famously say, "I wish that bull would kill me."
So these Sikorskys, I think they played such an important role, completely forgotten. And I try to, in terms of heroism, we talk about so many stories of heroism on this channel. It is incredible to imagine that they got up in those planes, don't have any weapons, and they have volunteers with rifles, which at best has got to be making them feel better. Because
you can't really get the point of that. And someone posted on that say, never underestimate a Marine with his rifle. I'm like, but
good luck.
Marine with his rifle shooting down a plane that's zero that's a lot of.
The plane's moving 3 times faster than the Sikorsky.
Yeah, much faster. Firing with 20mm cannons, a much greater range. And
you can't fire your rifle.
You've got a very
fast.
small chance, even if you pop him with your 30 caliber weapon, that it's going to do any harm to him.
You might get a lucky shot. I mean, I don't think it's
impossible.
impossible. Yeah. But certainly the odds were awfully.
Well, the windows didn't go down either. And they say if you had to shoot, you're supposed to beat the window out with the butt of the gun first.
Yeah, it's
and then or shoot out the door.
These are planes that were clearly not meant to go plane to plane combat. I mean, that's just that.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, you'd say that about a Catalina too. But
the
Catalina actually had machine guns on it to defend itself, and that would at least deter the adversary or something like that.
Yeah,
it would be a cooler story if they discovered the Japanese fleet or something like that. But I mean, what they really did is we didn't know after Pearl Harbor if they were planning a land invasion of Japan or of Hawaii, which was very possible.
Yeah.
And so they at least showed that the Japanese fleet was far enough away that wasn't the risk. And if it was coming, at least the JRSs likely would have seen it. So yeah, you are risking your own life, and you're just essentially asserting, if I get close enough that I see that fleet, I'm almost certainly going to get shot down.
Yeah,
and my goal is to radio it in before I go down.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and I mean, it was a very scary proposition. It was certainly very brave to get up in those planes.
Painted orange for delivering mail. Yeah,
this is not like these were painted to hide. They were literally bright. And it's interesting that they weren't. I don't know. They weren't targets. I don't know if the Japanese didn't know that they. I mean, ultimately could serve a similar role as the Catalinas, or what exactly there. But
it might be that they had only so much. I mean, there were other things that they wanted to attack that they didn't. But
they could only prioritize so much.
I don't think so. I don't think that they thought of the
mail planes,
JRS-1s as being a threat. Yeah.
And then that whole squadron, the utility squadron. Is really an unsung unit because I mean they continued to do important work throughout the war, and that's
I like that. I mean, honestly, we don't talk enough about it. I mean, they took mules all the way up Italy because that was the only way that you could be supplying troops, and those we haven't even talked about the Red Ball Express or the Trans-Alaska Highway or some of the other support sort of stuff. There's a lot to talk about, but I mean, there's for every troop in the field, if every person in the field, I forget what the numbers are, but I mean, a significant number of people behind the lines that are keeping them in the field, and we've talked some about that. Like my first episode was about Clufield Naval Supply Depot, but I mean it's kind of cool to talk about. I mean these are really the workhorses, and no one thinks about them. I mean they weren't sexy. They weren't. I mean there were more Navy sailors that were sailing aboard various support ships of all sorts of kinds than there were sailing on the battleships, and we don't get to hear about those.
And they were
the interesting story we haven't told yet about Pearl Harbor is the Neosha was right behind. It was in between California and Battleship Row, and it was a fleet oiler. It was there to oil the things, and they managed to get underway and get out of the way. I mean, imagine they're a big floating bomb, and they're like the only real ship on Battleship Row that got out of there, and it's a story itself.
I mean, it is incredible that the people who were getting ready, who were able to get anything halfway underway. I mean, it takes a lot of people to move a battleship.
It is, yeah. It was extraordinary that Nevada got out under steam, that California got her steam up. I mean, there's a lot going on to be able to get that, and especially since they really. I mean, it wasn't that we were totally clueless that we were on footage towards war. I mean, we talked about when we talked about the war that they had been. They said if you see a submarine, just go ahead and sink it. You don't have to ask permission. I mean, we knew that there was some risk going on, but I mean, they were just not. I mean, no one was thinking that day was going to be it. And so the fact that they were able to react so quickly, many of them, because it was a Liberty Day the day before, many of them didn't have their senior officers aboard, and they had only certain supplies of ready ammunition, and they still managed to engage. I mean, that's extraordinary. Yeah. And that's part of the story. If we go all the way back to the start, that's what makes Welch and Taylor so extraordinary too, is that there was no reason you should get a plane up. The whole idea was designed around you shouldn't get a plane up, and they did.
It's really incredible that they were. I mean, they were the reason that they were ready to go as early as they were was literally because they were already up, and they've been up all night, and but still
playing poker all night. Yeah, flying around in their tuxedos too. They had their tuxedo pants on still, and they got their airplanes. Yeah,
in the disaster and chaos that was Pearl Harbor, and as hopeless
that story's just insane. He's got a new Cadillac, and they're racing it up the road, and the Japanese are shooting at the car, and they manage to get in the planes, they manage to get in the air, and they manage to, I mean, we did very little damage to the attack, but they did. I mean, they shot down 5 or so of the 10 planes that our aircraft managed to shoot down.
Yeah, it ends up being, I mean, I guess token resistance essentially, but it's incredible to think because they believed that they could do something, and truly, you were talking about people who you would not have criticized if they had just been like, our planes must be gone, and just ducked for cover. That would not have
would have blamed them. I mean, they kept flying and stuff.
And instead there's just a devotion to duty there
I mean, if you want to call it heroism or what you want to call it, but there's a devotion to duty there that's extraordinary, because there were a lot of people at Pearl Harbor who no one would have said a word if you kept your head low, and instead they, went out to rescue people or to do whatever and put themselves in danger because of it.
Yeah, and so you were mentioning actually that this episode you got in touch with, or they got in touch with you actually, Welch's son.
Yeah. He saw the episode and called, and we chatted for a long time. He's an interesting guy. His dad died when he was fairly young because Jack Welch died in a jet accident, it was. He grew up kind of in the among that aircraft industry that developed in Southern California after the war, I think it was an interesting piece of history, and it was kind of interesting to hear the perspective of someone. His father was truly a hero, but I don't think he really got to know his father as a hero. So, I mean, that's kind of cool. One of the cool things that happens is the history guys that we get, and we'll get that when we talk about a lot. We've had family members get a hold of us and say, thank you for talking about our, our cousin or our uncle or whatever. And we've made a few episodes where someone got a hold of us and says, this is what my uncle did.
Yeah.
And, I love that. If you've got a Second World War story or First World War story or a Civil War story or whatever, and you know a family member and you know some details about it, we can tell a story around it. I'm happy to tell that story. Very grateful to you. I mean, send us the stuff and we'll make an episode.
Yeah.
And we've told some really, cool episodes that way.
Yeah. It's been really cool to see. In some cases, we've gotten some new information, even from folks who have been studying their own family, which absolutely. And I mean that's one of the cool things about history is that we think of it as you're reading the past, but to some extent you were learning new things about the past too, and stuff continues to come up.
Even in terms of World War II, though, too, we're just losing those stories. We're losing the veterans so quickly. There have been concerted efforts to try to get veterans to tell their stories, and you find a lot of places where that's been done. But I mean, there's still so many stories that weren't told. Virtually universally, you hear people say they never really talked about that time. Yeah. And so this, we have relatively little time to preserve those stories. So it's great when we can get one that gives us some stuff that we can fill in some other pieces of details, and you can really kind of tell the rich story that, I mean, the stuff that deserves to be remembered. I mean, because they're heroes, but also because, if you don't understand the past, then you're going to repeat it.
And these, it was an incredibly momentous piece of history, World War II, and it was terrible. And I can't say that, that it's good that so many people died or anything like that, but it changed a lot. The world was a very different place after the war than it was before. And, that's what history is about. And those people lived through it. We can talk about the bigger picture thing, but I think one of the things we like to do, and what you did on these episodes, is talked about kind of some of the smaller stuff. Is that these were people living through these who were. It wasn't just words on a page. This was,
when an event is so large,
I
mean it's so easy for you to lose other stories, all the stories in there. And and then there becomes sort of a motive to tell the few stories that you've got. Those end up kind of overshadowing other stories. So I think there's a lot of heroes of Pearl Harbor that are forgotten, and because there was just so much chaos going on, and then we had such a narrative afterwards. And this is a good way to tell them. But I mean, I think it happens in lots of different places. Yeah.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately.
That's, so I often look for all sorts of different sort of stuff off of what we do on the History Guy, because it's kind of what I'm doing when I'm not working. But this time I chose straight up history, straight up war history, and it's a documentary called Maggie's War. It's about an officer named James Magellan, who was an officer in the 82nd during the Second World War. It tells his whole story all the way from Italy, all the way through to when he goes to Berlin. And it's kind of what we were just talking about. I mean, it was told while he's still alive and can narrate his story and talk about what he did in his 90s when this documentary was made. So it's compelling. He was at some very important events throughout the war. He was a company commander in the airborne, and he did some incredibly heroic stuff. There's a point where he, with 2 hand grenades, took out a Panther tank, which, he's certainly an example of those World War II heroes, and a company commander who always led from the front. And it was thoroughly enjoyable to hear him tell the story and to have still people around that were his units to tell the story. And you're cognizant the whole time. Those stories are, we're losing those veterans all the time, and those stories aren't being told. Absolutely, it was just a hoot to watch. It's called Maggie's War. I love Magellan TV for a lot of different reasons. I can go there and learn about penguins, or I can go there and learn about pharaohs, or I can go there and get a really good story from the Second World War and the sort of stories that we like to tell on the History Guy. What have you been watching on Magellan TV?
So I maybe weirdly, the one I want to talk about today was also straight up history, and we've kind of gone different directions and stuff. But this one, I mean, I think we say this with a number of the history documentaries we watch. They feel a little bit like some stuff we do on the channel. And so what I watched was King Arthur the Legend, and I think we've done a couple of those where we talk about these kind of mythical figures and then try to look at the history behind them. So this one was really interesting. I like King Arthur as a story. I think it's a really interesting piece of history, but I think, and what the documentary is a lot about is, is there a historical Arthur? And to some extent, if, whether there was a real Arthur as a singular human being or not, the impact that the image of Arthur has had on history. And so it actually, it manages to go from essentially prehistoric times to then, of course, to the period that if Arthur existed, where he would have lived, which was that chaotic period after the Romans left. After
Rome, yeah.
And the Saxons are coming in. And I've read some great books. If you haven't, the Bernard Cornwell's trilogy on.
Yeah, we're both fans of Bernard Cornwell. If he's listening to the podcast, we're both fans. I'm sure he sits around and listens to our podcast.
I hope so.
And I'll have to watch that one. I'd love to. I like, because there is a fair point to say, no matter what else historically, Arthur certainly existed because those Arthurian legends impacted history in and of themselves. Yeah. I'll have to watch that one. Yeah.
Just like Magellan, it was something that was interesting. It was amazing. It was awesome to watch. And gosh, you can always go to be watching something else. I did want to mention that, we're in the holiday period, and you can get Magellan for 30% off for a lifelong learner. They've got a promo code for that. Okay,
so. and also that you can get gift cards. You can sell gift cards for, and you can get them year round. They're not just a Christmas thing. But that is a really good gift. If you know someone who loves history and they've not seen Magellan TV, then give them a month of Magellan TV, or you'll get a few months actually, because you get the free month anyway. Yeah. And then you get a discount and you got a gift card. And I tell you what, I use it more than any other subscription.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, The History Guy tells the story of the USS Nevada, the only battleship to have been sunk at Pearl Harbor and also been present at the D-Day landings.
D-Day, the Allied assault on Hitler's fortress Europe, occurred 75 years ago this year. The landings commenced on June 6th, 1944. More than 150,000 Allied troops would be involved in the largest amphibious invasion in history, landing at the points of northern France that were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Of the nearly 7,000 naval vessels that supported this massive landing, there was one that had already been sunk by the Axis powers 3.5 years earlier. The D-Day contributions of the USS Nevada, the only battleship to have been both at the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Normandy landings, deserves to be remembered. The landing area, called Utah Beach, was the point that was farthest west of the landings at D-Day. The goal was to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula in the hopes of capturing the port of Cherbourg, which Allied planners considered critical for supplying the European beachhead. The attack on Utah Beach was led by some 21,000 men of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, supported by tanks of the 70th Tank Battalion. Utah Beach, and, contrary to some apocryphal stories, there is no special meaning to the name, was defended by troops of the 709th Static Infantry Division. The division was made up largely of non-German conscripts, and it was assigned to occupation duties, and so was not as well equipped or trained as most troops of the German army. Their combat effectiveness was further reduced, as its more veteran units had been transferred to the Eastern Front, and the troops facing the 4th Infantry Division largely lacked combat experience. They were not trained in mobile warfare. They had little mechanized support. Still, they were trained in static defense. They knew their sector well, and the area had been heavily fortified. In an attempt to limit any landing, the Germans had flooded the farmland behind the beach, restricting the available travel. Even if the Allies could isolate the Cotentin Peninsula, the port of Cherbourg had significant defenses, including heavy guns. Utah Beach included a formidable seawall that had to be breached for the tanks of the 70th Tank Battalion to be able to move inland. The soldiers assaulting Utah Beach were fortunate. During the pre-battle aerial bombardment, the area had low cloud cover. Instead of abandoning the mission, the bomber group decided to attack from a lower altitude, placing their planes at greater risk. The decision meant that their bombing was more accurate and effective than it had been at other landing points, for a loss of only 4 bombers. What's more, the soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division had a significant naval bombardment group for support, centered on the battleship USS Nevada. Nevada had been the most modern battleship in the world when it was launched in July 1914. The first of the American standard-type battleships, the Nevada incorporated a number of important innovations that would be a part of all U.S. battleships that followed, including an oil-fired steam power plant rather than coal boilers, geared turbines, and all-or-nothing armor, which provided maximum armor over critical places like engines and magazines, and none over less important places. This allowed better armor over critical points for less weight. Nevada also was the first American battleship to mount 3 guns in a turret, allowing it to mount 10 massive 14-inch guns in 4 turrets. 2 battleships of the class were built, Nevada and Oklahoma. Both had been on Battleship Row on December 7, 1941. Nevada had not been moored next to another battleship, and was the only U.S. battleship to get underway during the Japanese attack. She was struck by 1 torpedo and 4 aerial bombs. Taking on water, she grounded near Ford Island to prevent her sinking in deeper water. Thus, Nevada was sunk in the first few minutes of America's violent entry into World War II, along with the battleships Arizona, California, West Virginia, and her sister ship, Oklahoma. Arizona, whose magazine had exploded, and Oklahoma, struck by as many as 8 torpedoes, were too damaged for salvage. But the other 3 battleships sunk that day were raised and returned to service. Using massive cranes, by mid-February, Nevada was refloated and repaired enough to sail to Puget Sound for repairs and modernization. She was at sea again in October of 1942, participated in the Battle of Attu in Alaska in May of 1943, and after more modernization and convoy duty in the Atlantic, was one of 6 battleships used to support the D-Day landings, along with the battleships Texas and Arkansas, and the British battleships Warspite, Ramillies, and Rodney. Nevada, the only battleship to be both at Pearl Harbor and at Normandy, and the only battleship assigned to support the landings at Utah Beach, had something to prove to the Axis that had sunk her 3.5 years before. The attack on Utah included approximately 14,000 paratroops of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Their job was to take critical crossroads, prevent reinforcement of Cherbourg. Some of the heaviest fighting took place behind the landing points at places like St. Mary-Église, with the lightly armed paratroops who had suffered significant casualties and were dispersed in the landings, desperately needed reinforcement. The big guns of Nevada, able to fire more than 15 miles, would be critical in breaking up enemy formations and preventing them moving reinforcements behind the lines. The invasion was massive. Nevada crewman Ralph Potts told the Reno Gazette-Journal in 2004 that you couldn't see the sky. There were so many airplanes flying overhead. Eugene Kidd, a Stewart First Class on one of the support vessels, was quoted in the Nevada State Journal of Reno, Nevada in October of 44. One of the greatest convoys in naval history was to engage in the battle under the aerial protection of fortresses, Spitfires, P-37s, and dive bombers, which made a virtual floor in the sky. Fenced in by 24 miles of destroyers, cruisers, battleships, supply and hospital ships, LSTs, PT boats, and landing boats of all descriptions. Petty Officer Franklin Sturgis on a Nevada gun crew said it was an immense thing to see, something one could never forget. The naval bombardment began at 4:45 a.m., 45 minutes before H hour. According to some reports, the Nevada was among the first of the Allied Armada to come under fire, a close call that straddled the ship, landing shells on either side. Nevada's captain, Powell Rhea, said, "We got out of that particular spot damn fast." But then came Nevada's turn. Kidd recalled, "I saw the battleship Nevada was the first to fire with any results on the shore, knocking out 2 batteries in a quarter of an hour." Petty Officer Sturgis, quoted in the Berkshire County Eagle of Pittsburgh, Massachusetts, explained, "Our job was to drench the beast with gunfire before troops landed, and to knock out enemy strongpoints afterwards." One of the first priorities was to knock holes in the Utah Beach's seawall. Otherwise, the tanks of the 70th Armored Battalion would be stuck on the beach. Nevada's 14-inch guns, lobbing 500-pound shells filled with TNT, quickly knocked 4 huge holes in the wall. But the Germans had nearly 70 different gun emplacements in the fortified area. The shells were coming close. Crewman Potts recalled, "We were getting shelled so close that we had to be like soldiers in a foxhole. I was on the port side. I had to go over to the starboard side to keep from getting splashed because the shells were getting too close." The firing was heavy. Potts recalled, "The guns got so hot that they got splashed with water, They sizzled. The first troops and tanks to the beach were drawn farther south by the tide than they expected, hitting the beach some 2,000 yards from their assigned landing zones. The mistake turned out to be fortunate, as the tide had dragged away many of the dangerous beach obstacles. Among the troops was the most senior Allied officer to land on the beach on D-Day, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the former president and assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division. He quickly appraised the situation and determined that the accidental landing spot was superior to the original plans, and ordered further landings there, saying he decided to start the war from right here. But the beach was protected by 2 German strongpoints composed of heavy guns under massive concrete casemates near the French hamlet of La Dune de Varvay. The casemates were manned by soldiers of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Regiment 919 and mounted the dreaded German 88s, 8.8-centimeter guns, as well as numerous other pieces. The strong points had to be neutralized in order to protect the thousands of troops on their way. Troops of the 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, accompanied by Sherman tanks of the 1st Platoon of Company A of the 746th Tank Battalion, attacked the bunkers, but the 75mm guns of the tanks had no effect on the heavy concrete. The assault was driven back, losing a tank to the 88s. And so they called in the mighty 14-inch guns of Nevada. After pounding the 2 massive casemates and forcing the Germans to retreat, Rhea ordered Nevada to move in another 1,100 yards. This not only allowed her 14-inch guns to better support the paratroopers, desperately holding positions inland, but allowed the Nevada to bring her batteries of 5-inch and twin 40mm guns into range, pounding the pillboxes and machine guns and other secondary fortifications along the beach. Seaman First Class J. Gibbon of Lee's Summit, Missouri, was a loader in one of the 5-inch guns. His crew officer noticed that after each round, Gibbon held up his right hand. The officer assumed that the signal meant okay and continued feeding the gun. In fact, in the fast loading, Gibbon's hand had been caught between 2 shells. His finger was broken and nearly severed. In the first 2 hours and 10 minutes of firing, Gibbon loaded 26,730 pounds, more than 30 tons of 5-inch shells, with the broken finger, until someone figured out what his signal meant and he was replaced. Despite the injury, he never let the fire falter. Another crewman loaded over 800 shells, weighing 70 pounds each, over a period of 4 hours, without relief. Sturgis recalled, "I worked hard passing ammunition. We slept on the deck and ate K rations. That was how the entire crew fought the battle," a war correspondent aboard Nevada said of them. "These were men who slept only an hour or 2 during all this time, slept for 15 minutes at a time sitting upright in radio rooms, slept for half an hour at a time sprawled over one another on the gun mounts." Nevada, at times the only artillery available inland, was renowned for the accuracy of its fire. Its missions were critical to the lightly armed airborne troops trying to hold causeways and crossroads now being assaulted by German armor. A firing mission on June 8th was called to attack a formation of 90 tanks and 20 lorries, and then bombard the road that they had used to get there. In 20 minutes, they were told by the spotter, "Fire very effective. All tanks and lorries destroyed or damaged. None got away." Ship was able to fire with such accuracy because of the close coordination between Navy and Army. As the Danville Morning News of Danville, Pennsylvania explained in July of 1944, each Army battalion was assigned a fire control party consisting of 1 naval and 1 Army officer and 12 Army enlisted men who were technicians skilled in radio communications. The Navy men were given Army training and the Army men were given Navy training to the extent that all the men in the unit understood both the problems of the ground and sea forces in the operation. An Army spotter near St. Mary-Glees, First Lieutenant Joseph Hull, was contacted by a patrol of paratroopers trapped by a concentration of 9 enemy tanks. Hull said, "I contacted the Nevada, and the second salvo hit the first 2 tanks in line. That was some shooting, so I called for rapid fire, and in a short while the Nevada had scored direct hits on 7 of the tanks. The 2 remaining tanks were destroyed by exploding ammunition from the others." Army Fire Control Officer First Lieutenant William B. French said, "The Nevada shooting was the prettiest sight of the war as far as the paratroopers were concerned. Those guns cleared out that road like a bulldozer." Nevada's fire was so accurate that at times it was firing 15 miles to hit targets less than 500 yards from Allied troops. When an aerial spotter called in the location of a 155mm battery, in less than an hour the plane spotting reported guns, shelter, headquarters, all completely destroyed. Nevada continued to attack troop concentrations, breaking up counterattacks and disrupting German attempts to reinforce Cherbourg. Another time a spotter called in a battery of 4 German guns. Nevada straddled the guns in just 2 shots, completely silencing the battery in less than 20 minutes. The Nevada had done so from an astounding 17.5 miles away. From the start of the bombardment, the crew of the Nevada was at general quarters, meaning the crew was at battle stations firing their guns for 80 hours straight. The Boston Globe described the more than 1,200 14-inch shells fired in the first 6 days of the invasion as approximately 1.5 million of your war bonds that couldn't be better spent. The Danville Morning News of Danville, Pennsylvania opined that the slugger of the ships which made the assaults on the shore positions in France was the Nevada. The battleship has become legend among the thousands of doughboys in France. And in perhaps the most direct compliment regarding the Navy's role at D-Day, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Rudder of the 2nd Raider Battalion said, "Tell the Navy, we love them." The assault on Utah Beach was costly. The paratroopers suffered some 2,500 casualties and another 700 men died at sea. But the 4th Infantry Division landed 21,000 men on the beach at Utah for a cost of only 197 casualties. A stunning fact for which the heavy and accurate fire of the USS Nevada deserves some credit. Her heavy guns would be needed again just a few days later for the assault on Cherbourg, and then later in August, and the second D-Day, the attack on southern France called Operation Dragoon, before she was sent to the Pacific and participated in the bombardment during the Battle of Okinawa. After the war, more than 32 years old, the Navy decided that Nevada was simply too old to retain, but she proved difficult to sink. She survived not one, but 2 atomic blasts, one in which she was literally painted orange because she was supposed to be the target of the bomb, and yet she did not sink. She was hauled to Hawaii, used for target practice by the USS Iowa, failed to sink her. Finally, she was sunk by an aerial torpedo, stubborn to the last.
The next episode takes us from the attack on Pearl Harbor and then all the way to D-Day. And so this was of the many battleships that were sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor. Nevada was the only one that actually got underway, and it sustained significant damage. But
it did. I mean, she was sinking.
Yeah.
There's a lot of argument over whether they moved her to shallow water to make her easier to recover, or whether they moved her to shallow water in order to prevent her from blocking the channel. There's some argument over that. But in any which case, yes. I mean, she was sunk at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And the really extraordinary story about Nevada at Pearl Harbor is that they had a bomb. If you want to talk about Japanese planning for the battle, I mean, they created specific weapons for this battle, but they had these armor-piercing bombs that were made out of decommissioned, obsolete 16-inch artillery shells. Wow. And those did go straight, and that's what blew up Arizona, and that's probably what holed the California, and that is what hit the Nevada. The thing is, the Nevada had been through just normal maintenance, had been through a process of switching out its ammunition, so that went into its forward magazine. Nevada could have blown up like Arizona did. But I mean, it went into an empty magazine. That's an extraordinary story. Yeah, but
gosh, yeah, that's
She was sunk at Pearl Harbor. She had to be raised. She had to be repaired. She had to be modernized, and then she ended up serving in so many distinctive ways.
Yeah,
and she's she's a grand old ship. She really is. And her story at D-Day is, I mean, the Texas story at D-Day is quite exciting too. Yeah. We haven't told Arkansas yet. We haven't told there's a few stories still to tell at D-Day as well. But there are so many stories of heroism at Pearl Harbor. There are so many stories of heroism at D-Day, and here's this story of both. And golly, if you're talking about getting revenge against the Axis, I mean, Nevada is a good story of that. She really is. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually noticed that there are a number of similarities between the Texas and the Nevada. I guess I thought I kind of just in my the back of my head had thought the Nevada was a much more modern ship than the Texas, but it actually launched only 2 years later, and it was kind of the culmination of a number of new technologies and new concepts, because it had like the all-in armor and all or nothing. That's what they called it, right? That's the
all or nothing armor, which Texas was kind of in between there.
Yeah.
I mean, they were starting to see the strategy at the time.
Yeah.
But Texas was in so many ways a test bed, and those test beds then led to the other classes, the new classes.
Because the Nevada launched only 2 years later, I think, 1916.
Yeah. I mean, she started she had some 3-gun turrets, but also some 2-gun turrets. And I mean, she clearly is transitional when you look at to the newer battleships there. She was. I mean, those old battleships still had a lot that they could do.
Yeah, well, both of them served throughout the war admirably, and especially in ways we didn't necessarily expect them to, because I think that we didn't necessarily know that the war that naval warfare was going to be essentially all planes before World War II. I think that was really a lot changed.
I mean, like Billy Mitchell clearly had that as a vision and stuff like that. But that's one of the things also about Pearl Harbor too, is that the Japanese had really kind of figured out the meaning of aircraft carriers more than we had. At Pearl Harbor, the aircraft carriers, one of the biggest reasons that the Japanese didn't fly the third strike, which could have attacked the oil tankers and all that stuff, that the oil reserves and things that Nimitz talked about, was that they knew that the aircraft carriers weren't there, and so they were afraid that there was some significant air group out there they didn't know where it was. They no longer had the element of surprise, and so carriers, made a difference at Pearl Harbor even by not being at Pearl Harbor. But yeah, we didn't know that that naval aviation was going to make such a difference in the naval war at the time. And luckily by D-Day, the Allied fleet didn't have a significant fear. I mean, the Luftwaffe did do some stuff at D-Day, but I mean, by then we had enough air superiority that we didn't even have an aircraft carrier at D-Day. But
certainly there was danger to the ships. I don't think there was any.
You see that because when you see refit and modernization during the war, all of it every time it is adding more anti-aircraft guns. That's what they're doing. They're like, they had torpedoes. How quaint, rip out the torpedoes and another 6 anti-aircraft guns.
They're always.
That's really what they were doing throughout. Yeah.
It's actually kind of interesting to read through. We just did one on the Texas at Okinawa, and that was toward the end of the war, and they still at the end were like, we should have more anti-aircraft guns.
We need more anti-aircraft guns. Yeah,
there really was no such thing as too many anti-aircraft guns, but I thought it was both of them served at D-Day, but the Nevada had a different. It was on a different beach. It was fighting a different.
It was, yeah.
And the Texas has some great stories. I mean, told some really
Texas
cool stories.
Texas was at Omaha Beach, and Nevada was over at Utah Beach.
Yeah.
And Utah Beach went a lot better than Omaha Beach. But part of that might have been because the shore bombardment. I mean, one of the reasons for that had to do with the air bombardment. But part of that was that the shore bombardment was very successful at Utah, and that opened up the beach. But I mean, there were so many interesting things that happened there too. The original landing craft were washed by current downstream, and then they got there, and Teddy Roosevelt Jr. said, "Hey, this is a better place to land." And I mean, there's a lot of things that went right at Utah that just didn't go right at Omaha. But certainly, Utah would have gone much more poorly were it not for the extraordinary marksmanship of the Nevada. And having studied that battle, there is a whole lot of really extraordinary commentary about how good the Nevada was at targeting, so that 15 miles inland, they're shooting at targets that are 500 yards from our troops.
Crazy. I mean, honestly wild, and that there doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of friendly fire. And I mean, that's stuff you're always concerned about when you're firing.
Yeah. You would think with these big 15-inch guns, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of friendly fire incident, even though they're calling them in. And one of the stories there is they're being attacked by German tanks, and they lay in on this tank column, and they're talking about direct hits.
Oh my God!
A tank is built to withstand pretty heavy guns. It's hard for an infantryman to do damage. They can, but it's hard. But I mean, you have to think they're kind of surprised when a 15-inch battleship round is coming in. Yeah, that'll come straight through the roof of your tank. Yeah, there's no
I can't imagine that any of them were able to withstand a shot from a naval gun.
I mean, if you were landing anywhere near with those naval guns, then that was the end of the tank. Yeah. But I mean, they're talking about knocking out whole artillery batteries, and I mean, it's incredible, what battleships can do. Yeah, and then Nevada is a great example of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's truly, I mean, it's an example of so many things, because certainly, Utah went fairly well as far as the landings went.
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly in terms of the casualties.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, Utah also had a lot of airborne landings behind it that actually had, took a lot of casualties and things like that. It just was not the slaughter on the beach that Omaha was.
When we look back at it now, I think that we sometimes forget just how precarious that landing could have been, and how precarious it was at times. And certainly it was the fact that they couldn't, the tanks, the Shermans couldn't break through through fortifications. It's a little funny to be like, when a 76 isn't going to work, let's go throw in
let's go through a 15-inch round or 5-inch round.
That'll
I mean, the seawall, I mean, there's a lot of things could have gone wrong at Utah. And the aerial bombardment was more successful at Utah because they were trying to go below clouds. But there are a lot of things, and they didn't. I mean, the fact that there were fewer casualties there, that it was not the sort of slaughter that Omaha was, where they literally were talking about we might have to evacuate the beach. Yeah. That didn't happen at Utah, and a good chunk of that was because of Nevada. I mean, it has to take a lot of credit there. And when you even have airborne troops saying, the Nevada is saving us, miles inland. I mean, that's incredible. And there's so many stories there. There's just stories of how they took the naval, they cross-trained the Army and the Navy so that the Army guys understood the Navy guns, the Navy guys understood the Army guns, and then those guys were working together. And that really turned that into such an incredible weapon of war. And that's cool. I mean, it's particularly cool because she's a very old ship, She was built for the First World War. Yeah. And here she was playing such a significant role in such a significant battle. because the way they'd figured out how to use her, 14-inch guns.
Yeah, that kind of combined arms idea where they're I mean it's something that seems simple when you think about it, but that was not easy to do. I mean it was sometimes very difficult to have various branches working with each other, and this was such a successful example of that. Mm-hmm. It really is quite incredible. I mean, all of these stories. I mean, the story of the guy who broke his finger like early on, and then he's still just loading. He keeps raising his hand.
He's trying to
like,
wave
please,
and say my finger's broken, and the guy doesn't understand what he's saying, so he just loaded all those 5-inch rounds, whipping through there with his finger broken.
Yeah, he just, as long as he was in his position, he was loading the guns. I mean, that's I
said that they were getting splashed so much that he went over to the other side of the ship just so he could get dry. They're going to shower some. They were straddled on the first fire, and then they moved the ship right away. And I mean, there's we don't necessarily think about, when you think about the Navy at D-Day, when you think about the Navy at the beaches, you're really thinking about how much supply that they moved so quickly, and that's an extraordinary story. But I think we tell a lot less the story of the Navy's engagement during the battle than we talk about the Army. And obviously, the landing was an incredible, and these people were under fire, and huge amounts of heroism there, or people that were dropping behind the lines, so there's so much that's going on. But I mean, these guys, in the Navy that were, they were essentially at station. Cracking those guns. You wonder how any of them ever heard again. I mean, half those guys had to be deaf when they got home. But I mean, they're firing these guns for 80, 90 hours straight, right? And
crazy. Yeah. We've been on board the Texas, which the Nevada, I imagine, is somewhat different, but similar in that, I mean, these are enclosed spaces. Yeah. And I can't imagine firing the guns from inside the turret. Just the volume.
And you can't even see outside. No. There's the air, the smoke, the smell. Just being in there with someone who hadn't showered in 80 hours is kind of hard to imagine when you're down in there. Yeah, and it really, I mean, because they were at risk. There was shore batteries that certainly couldn't hurt a battleship there, so I mean, I think that the heroism of the Nevada is worth mentioning, and honestly, the troops on the ground thought it was worth mentioning because of what Nevada did for them. Yeah, and you could tell that story. I mean, there were a lot of cruisers and destroyers, and I mean, you could tell that story with a lot of ships at D-Day. They really did go above and beyond to support those ground trips, and it was a fantastic example of the two working in concert in a way that they maybe weren't so good at when they landed in North Africa. But by the time they got to D-Day, they were much better.
It was amphibious landings are very difficult. And I mean, gosh, we found in World War II sometimes that they're difficult. I mean, the landing at Dieppe and at Anzio. I mean, both of those we learned that it's hard. It's a very complex operation, and certainly
generally not successfully done in the First World War. I mean, there were attempts, but there was no one really knew how to do it. And
nothing on the scale of Normandy, pretty much, except Normandy, and it's truly incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there's some arguments over in the Pacific whether Okinawa was actually bigger than Normandy, Iwo Jima bigger than Normandy, and we learned a lot of lessons there in Europe too. But I mean, this Normandy was something that was absolutely unprecedented at the time. No one had even considered something that big, that coordinated, with armies from 5 nations, I think we landed,
and successful.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, and it was incredible how much planning went into it. And the Nevada story is particularly poignant because it was at Pearl Harbor originally, and so
it was at Pearl Harbor. Yeah, the first act that brought us into the war was to sink the Nevada, and then she not only rose from that. But that she was there at D-Day. I mean, it's an extraordinary story, and that's why we kind of told it in the video. The only ship that was at both. Yeah. And she, continued to serve bravely. I mean, I like the story of her sinking. I mean, they just couldn't sink her. She refused to go down. Yeah.
It is something else, and I know that I think we've talked about this a couple of times. It's hard to see history like that go down, but it's difficult also to maintain these ships. And
I will say hear that all the time, like why didn't Nevada preserve the Nevada or whatever? And it's true, but it is incredibly expensive. We've learned that working with the people at the Texas, and she's a wonderful ship, the USS Texas. But I mean, we've got a fair amount of museum ships, and they compete for resources. And I think that they all struggle constantly competing for those resources. So I mean, how many of the ships could we have preserved? So it does seem, a terrible tragedy that we just took Nevada, who served so bravely, and just took it out to sea somewhere and shot at it until it went underwater. And you even wonder why we couldn't turn it into razor blades. Yeah. But I mean, at least we'd have the razor blades. But I mean, in a realistic sense, I mean, the fleet that we had by the end of the Second World War was huge. We preserved it for a long time in mothballs, just in case the war started again. But I mean, there's only so much you can actually do in terms of preserving, things that old. And so I'm sorry that she's not around, and I'm glad that we have a few pieces of her that we can use to remember her. But I mean, the story, I mean, the history, that's what we have to hang on to.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.